The first bullet struck the field hospital before anyone heard the gunfire. It punched through the narrow window above bed 7, shattered a tray of surgical instruments, and buried itself in the concrete wall. Metal clattered across the floor. A wounded soldier screamed. The overhead lights flickered once, twice, then vanished. For half a second, the entire ward froze in darkness. Nurse Mara Vance did not. She dropped the forceps in her hand, caught the edge of the hospital bed, and pulled it away from the window with a single hard motion. "Down," she said. Her voice was quiet. It carried farther than a shout. Everyone below the window line. Now, the young soldier on the bed stared at her, pale and confused. A half-finished row of stitches ran along his shoulder. His name was Private Ellis, 19 years old, 6 days into his first deployment. "What's happening?" Mara pressed one hand against his bandage and lowered him behind the steel frame. "Keep your head down." Outside, the night erupted. Automatic fire rolled across the compound in short, disciplined bursts. Warning sirens began to howl. Somewhere beyond the eastern wall, a heavy explosion shook dust from the ceiling. The generator died. Red emergency lights blinked on, painting the ward in the color of old blood. Doctors and medics moved between beds, struggling to understand where the attack was coming from. Patients called for help. Boots struck the floor. A nurse near the supply room stood motionless, both hands pressed over her mouth. Mara looked toward the ceiling. She was not listening to the screams. She was counting the shots. 3 bursts from the north ridge. A pause. 2 more from the eastern perimeter. Then the deeper rhythm of a mounted weapon opening fire near the front gate. This was not random harassment. Someone was shaping the battlefield. Another round cracked through the wall and passed through the space where Mara's head had been seconds earlier. She did not flinch. "Move every patient into the surgical corridor," she ordered. "Use the interior wall. No one crosses the main hallway." Captain Daniel Reeve, the hospital's senior physician, turned toward her. "Mara, security hasn't given an evacuation order." "They won't." Reeve stared at her. "What?" "The communications tower is already down." As if summoned by her words, the radio on the admissions desk released a burst of static and went silent. The room seemed to shrink around them. "Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in courage and respect, hit like and subscribe. These stories inspire change, and we're glad you're here." Now back to Mara. A third explosion struck closer than the first. The eastern doors buckled inward. Mara crossed the ward quickly, checking each patient as she moved. She adjusted an oxygen mask, secured a drainage line, and shoved a medicine cart against a window without wasting a single step. Everything about her changed. The night nurse who usually spoke in soft sentences and carried extra blankets for restless patients was gone. In her place stood someone precise. Someone cold. Someone who had seen this before. 2 teams, she said. One moves the patients. One stays with the critical cases. Kill every unnecessary light. A medic named Foster hesitated. "Who put you in command?" Mara looked at him. Not angrily. Not defensively. Just long enough for him to understand that this was not the moment to argue. "Do it." He did. Beds began rolling toward the reinforced surgical wing. Wheels rattled over broken glass. Medical staff bent low as they pushed wounded soldiers through the red-lit corridor. Mara remained near the center of the ward. She watched the windows. She watched the doors. Most of all, she watched the shadows moving beneath the damaged entrance. Private Ellis reached for her sleeve. "Are they coming inside?" Mara looked down at him. He was trying to appear brave, but his hand was trembling. She covered it briefly with her own. "Yes." The honesty frightened him more than any comforting lie could have. "How many?" Mara turned toward the eastern doors. The hinges groaned. Boots scraped against gravel outside. At least 4 men were gathering beyond the entrance. Maybe more. They were waiting for the mounted weapon to shift its fire toward the barracks before breaching the hospital. They knew exactly what they were doing. Mara's eyes moved to the far end of the room. A gray medical cabinet stood beside the blood storage refrigerator. It appeared identical to every other supply locker in the hospital, except for the reinforced lock beneath its handle. Only Mara carried the key. Captain Reeve followed her gaze. "What's in that cabinet?" She did not answer. A shadow passed behind the frosted glass doors. Then another. The handle moved. Someone outside tested it slowly. Mara stepped away from Ellis's bed and removed her medical gloves one finger at a time. Around her, the last patients disappeared into the surgical corridor. Reeve remained beside the doorway, unwilling to leave her alone. "Mara," he said again, his voice lower now. "What is in that cabinet?" The eastern doors shook beneath a heavy impact. Wood cracked. The nurse who had worked beside them for 4 months reached beneath her uniform and pulled a small black key from a chain around her neck. Her hands were perfectly steady, something I hoped I would never need again. The doors shook a second time. This time, one of the hinges tore free. Mara walked toward the locked cabinet. Behind her, Private Ellis whispered the question everyone in the ward was suddenly thinking. "Who are you?" Mara inserted the key. The lock opened with a quiet click. Outside, the attackers prepared to breach. Inside, the night nurse opened the cabinet and reached for the life she had buried years ago. For hours earlier, the field hospital had been quiet enough to hear the wind scrape sand against the outer walls. The medical compound sat near the southern edge of Forward Operating Base Calder, a temporary installation surrounded by low hills and unfinished barriers. During the day, helicopters came and went in clouds of dust. At night, the place seemed smaller, almost fragile beneath the open sky. Mara Vance preferred the night shift. There were fewer questions after midnight. Fewer officers trying to impress one another. Fewer soldiers looking at her uniform and deciding they already understood who she was. She moved through the ward with a clipboard tucked beneath one arm, checking 4 lines, replacing dressings, and recording temperatures under the dim glow of portable lamps. Her dark hair was tied into a neat bun. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbows. A plain silver watch rested against her wrist. Nothing about her appearance demanded attention. That was exactly how she liked it. "Bed 3 needs another blanket," said Nurse Leah Morgan from the supply table. Mara nodded. "Already warming one." Leah smiled. "Of course you are." Mara crossed to the cabinet, removed a folded thermal blanket, and carried it to an older sergeant recovering from shrapnel wounds. He had been pretending to sleep for nearly an hour, but his eyes opened when she approached. "You always walk that quiet?" he asked. "Yes." "Scares people. Only the ones not paying attention." The sergeant gave a tired laugh as she placed the blanket over him. "You ever think about becoming an instructor?" "No, why not?" Mara adjusted the edge of the blanket around his shoulder. "I prefer patients who listen." He laughed again, then winced. Across the ward, 3 young soldiers occupied beds near the western wall. Their injuries were minor compared with the others: cuts, bruises, and one deep wound caused by a vehicle rollover during an afternoon patrol. The loudest of them was Corporal Mason Briggs. Briggs was 24, broad-shouldered, and convinced that every room needed his opinion. He had already complained about the food, the beds, the pain medication, and the fact that the hospital had no television. When Mara approached with a tray of clean instruments, he looked at the needle in her hand and leaned away dramatically. "Easy night shift," he said. "Some of us still need our arms for fighting." His 2 friends laughed. Mara placed the tray beside him. "You needed that arm for driving too." Briggs frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means the medic's report says you ignored a direct warning and took the vehicle down an unstable slope." The laughter stopped. One of his friends looked toward the ceiling. Briggs forced a grin. "So you read reports. Impressive." Mara inspected the wound along his upper arm. Blood had begun seeping through the bandage again. "You reopened the stitches." "I moved." "You were told not to." "I don't take orders from nurses." Mara looked at him for a moment. Then she reached for fresh gauze. "No, you take orders from gravity." The soldier in the next bed covered his mouth to hide a laugh. Briggs stared at her. Mara continued working without expression. Her hands were small, but they moved with complete confidence. She cleaned the wound, checked the stitching, and tightened a new bandage with enough pressure to stop the bleeding without cutting circulation. Briggs watched her fingers. "You ever hold anything more dangerous than a needle?" Leah glanced up from across the room. Mara did not. "Sometimes scissors." His friends laughed again. Briggs pointed toward the far wall, where an old security rifle sat locked behind reinforced glass. "What about that? You even know which end points forward." Mara tied the bandage and stepped back. "The end you shouldn't stand in front of." For the first time, one of Briggs's friends looked at her with interest instead of amusement. Briggs, however, only smirked. "Right. Tough nurse." Mara removed her gloves and dropped them into a disposal bin. You've lost more blood than you realize. Drink the water. Stay in bed. What happens if I don't? She met his eyes. You'll fall when you stand up. Briggs grinned. You sure about that? Yes. He swung his legs over the side of the bed. His boots touched the floor. For 1 second, he looked satisfied. Then the color drained from his face. His knees folded. Mara caught him beneath the arm before he hit the ground. She guided him back onto the mattress with controlled ease, as though she had expected the exact moment his balance would fail. The room went quiet. Briggs looked up at her, embarrassed and angry. Mara adjusted his pillow. Drink the water. He did not argue again. She turned away and continued down the aisle. Most people saw only a nurse doing her job. They did not notice how she never stood with her back to an entrance. They did not notice that she identified aircraft by sound before anyone else looked up. They did not notice how her eyes moved across rooftops, windows, and distant ridgelines whenever she stepped. Outside, at 11:43 p.m., Mara paused beside the hospital's rear door. The wind had changed. The guard dogs near the northern checkpoint had stopped barking. Beyond the wire, the hills were black and still. Too still. Mara listened for several seconds. Then she looked toward the communications tower. Its warning light blinked once, twice, and went dark. Mara stood beneath the rear doorway and watched the darkness beyond the wire. The communications tower should have carried a steady red light through the night. Instead, the top of the structure had vanished into blackness. No maintenance crew had been scheduled. No storm had crossed the valley, and the dogs were still silent. Behind her, the hospital continued its slow midnight rhythm. Monitors beeped. For pumps clicked. Someone coughed behind a curtain. Briggs muttered something to the soldier beside him, already recovering from the embarrassment of nearly collapsing. Mara stepped outside. The air was colder than it had been 10 minutes earlier. Dust moved in thin lines across the ground, gathering against the concrete barriers. She looked north. The nearest watchtower was visible only as a dark shape against the stars. The guard inside should have swept the perimeter with a searchlight every 30 seconds. The beam did not appear. Mara counted. 30 seconds. 40. 50. Nothing. Lieutenant Aaron Cole emerged from the administration tent carrying a metal cup of coffee. He was the officer responsible for security during the night shift, though he wore the responsibility loosely. You planning to stand out here all night? He asked. Mara kept her eyes on the ridge. The northern tower missed its sweep. Cole looked toward it, then shrugged. Probably a tired guard. The communications beacon is down. Generator fluctuation. The dogs stopped barking. That made him smile. Maybe they finally learned some discipline. Mara turned toward him. They weren't barking at nothing. They were barking at movement. Cole took a slow drink from his cup. You see movement? No, then we don't have a problem. Mara looked back toward the hills. A faint sound drifted across the valley. Not an engine. Not wind. Metal. Touching stone. Then silence again. She had heard that sound before. Equipment carried too close to rock. A buckle, a rifle sling, or a tool striking a hard surface. Small mistakes made by men trying to move quietly. How many guards are posted on the eastern wall? She asked. Cole sighed. 4. Call them. The radio net is being checked. Use the hard line. He lowered his coffee. Nurse Vance, I appreciate the concern, but perimeter security is not part of your assignment. Mara's expression did not change. Neither is being overrun. Cole stared at her for a second, uncertain whether she was joking. She was not. Briggs's voice came from the hospital doorway. What's going on? He stood with one hand against the frame, ignoring the instruction to remain in bed. His face was pale, but the familiar arrogance had returned. Night shift thinks she heard ghosts, he said. Cole glanced at him. Get back inside, Corporal. Briggs looked past Mara toward the empty ridge. This is a hospital, not a sniper nest. Mara's eyes remained fixed on the hills. Tonight, it may become both. The word silenced them. For several seconds, nothing moved. Then a white flare rose from behind the northern ridge. It burned for less than a second before disappearing. Cole's cup stopped halfway to his mouth. That ours? Briggs asked. No, Mara said. She was already moving. She crossed the yard toward the main building, her steps fast but controlled. Cole followed. What was it? A signal. To whom? Mara opened the hospital door. To the men waiting east of us. The lights flickered overhead. Once. Twice. Then returned. Inside, Leah looked up from the medication table. Mara, Move the critical patients away from the exterior walls. Captain Reeve emerged from the surgical room. What happened? We may have company. Briggs laughed weakly from behind them. Based on one flash in the hills. Mara turned toward him. Based on the dead tower, the silent dogs, the missing patrol sweep, and the fact that someone just signaled from a restricted ridge. Cole reached for the wall phone. The line was dead. His expression changed. For the first time that night, he looked afraid. Mara walked to the admissions desk and opened the emergency equipment drawer. Inside were flashlights, trauma tags, spare batteries, and a folded map of the compound. She spread the map across the desk. Lock the western entrance. Keep the southern corridor clear. Move oxygen tanks away from the windows. Captain Reeve watched her place 2 fingers on the eastern access road. How do you know they'll come from there? Because the northern ridge is a distraction. A distant pop sounded outside. Then another. Not gunfire. Suppressed shots. The ward fell silent. Mara looked toward the dark windows. They're already inside the outer perimeter. The first burst of gunfire came from the northern wall. It was loud, fast, and meant to draw every eye in the compound. Lieutenant Cole reacted exactly as the attackers expected. Security team to the north perimeter. He shouted into a handheld radio that returned only static. All available personnel, move north. Mara caught his arm before he reached the door. No, Cole pulled away. They're firing on the tower. They want you looking at the tower. Another burst cracked across the night. The hospital windows trembled in their frames. From the eastern side of the compound came a softer sound. A metallic click. Then the faint scrape of a ladder against concrete. Mara turned toward it immediately. There. Cole heard nothing. What? The east wall. Briggs leaned against the admissions desk, one hand pressed over his bandage. You can tell that from inside? Mara ignored him. She crossed to the nearest window, but stayed below the frame. Slowly, she lifted a polished steel tray and angled it toward the glass. The reflection showed only darkness at first. Then a shape rose above the eastern barrier. A helmet. A shoulder. The outline of a rifle. Mara lowered the tray. They're climbing over. Captain Reeve's face tightened. How many? At least 6 in the first group. Cole stared at her. You saw one man. One man above the wall. A team below him. You can't know that. Mara met his eyes. They would not send one. The hospital's emergency lights flickered again. Mara moved toward the ward. Leah, prepare the surgical corridor. Foster, disconnect every patient who can be moved without power. Reeve, keep the operating room sealed until I say otherwise. Reeve did not question her this time. Staff began moving. Briggs watched them with disbelief. You're all taking orders from a nurse now? Mara stopped beside his bed. No, they're taking cover. A sharp whistle cut through the night. Mara dropped instantly. Down. An explosion struck the eastern courtyard. The blast shattered 2 windows and sent a wave of dust through the ward. Glass sprayed across empty beds. A ceiling panel collapsed where Leah had been standing moments earlier. Screams filled the room. Mara was already back on her feet. She pulled a wounded medic away from the window and pressed gauze against a cut along his neck. Surface wound, she said. Keep pressure on it. Cole crouched behind the admissions desk, stunned. That was inside the perimeter. Yes. How did they get that close? They were close before the first shot. The eastern door shook under a heavy impact. Every person in the ward turned toward it. One hinge bent inward. Someone outside struck it again. Briggs reached for the security rifle behind the reinforced glass. The cabinet was locked. Where's the key? Cole searched his pockets. I don't have it. Briggs slammed his palm against the glass. Then break it. Mara looked at the rifle. It was old, poorly maintained, and positioned where everyone in the room could see it. A decoy for frightened people. Not a real defense. Leave it, she said. Briggs turned on her. They're about to come through that door. That rifle will jam after the first magazine. You don't know that. The feed lips are bent. The bolt is dry. The front sight is loose. Briggs stared at the weapon, then at her. Mara had noticed all of it without touching the glass. A third impact struck the door. The frame split. Leah appeared at the surgical corridor. Most of the patients are inside. We still have 4 who can't be moved. Mara nodded. Stack the beds along the interior wall. Kill the lights. No one stands in the center aisle. Captain Reeve grabbed her shoulder. What are you going to do? Mara looked toward the gray cabinet near the blood refrigerator. The one with the reinforced lock. The one no one had ever seen her open. I'm going to buy you time. Briggs laughed, but there was no confidence left in it. With what? Mara reached beneath her uniform and pulled a black key from the chain around her neck. The eastern door groaned. A gloved hand appeared through the broken frame. Mara inserted the key into the cabinet. Cole stepped closer. What is in there? She turned the lock. Inside, beneath folded medical blankets, rested a compact sniper rifle, a suppressed sidearm, sealed magazines, and a weathered black case marked with a faded trident. Nobody spoke. Briggs looked from the weapons to Mara. His face changed slowly as the meaning reached him. Mara removed the rifle and checked the chamber. Her movements were smooth, practiced, and terrifyingly familiar. Captain Reeve whispered, "Mara, who were you?" She seated the magazine with a quiet click. Outside, the attackers prepared to breach. Mara raised her eyes toward the door. Someone who knows what happens next. The eastern door burst inward. A man in dark clothing crossed the threshold with his rifle raised. Mara fired once. The suppressed shot sounded like a hard cough inside the ward. The attacker dropped before his second foot touched the floor. For one frozen second, nobody moved. Then the man behind him tried to push through. Mara shifted half a step, fired again, and struck the weapon from his hands. He disappeared behind the broken frame as the others outside scattered for cover. "Move the last patients," Mara said. Her voice remained calm. Leah and Foster obeyed immediately. They rolled 2 beds toward the surgical corridor while Captain Reeve pulled an oxygen cart behind them. Wheels caught on broken glass. One patient cried out as the bed jolted over the debris. Mara stayed between them and the entrance. Briggs stared at the faded trident on the case. "That symbol," he said. "Naval Special Warfare." Mara did not look at him. "Keep pressure on your arm." "You were a SEAL?" Another burst of fire punched through the outer wall. Mara dropped behind the admissions desk and pulled Briggs down with her ass. Concrete dust filled the air. "That is not the question you should be asking." "What should I be asking?" She checked the rifle's magazine. "How long before they try the rear entrance?" As if in answer, a metallic crash sounded from the opposite side of the building. Mara's eyes narrowed. "They're splitting." Lieutenant Cole crouched beside the desk, clutching his sidearm with both hands. "What do we do?" Mara pointed toward the corridor. "You take Briggs and cover the western junction." Cole looked at her as though she had spoken another language. "I'm the security officer." "Then start acting like one." The words struck harder than a shout. Cole's jaw tightened, but he nodded. He helped Briggs to his feet. Mara turned to Reeve. "How many patients remain in the ward?" 4. 2 are ventilated. 1 has abdominal trauma. The last is sedated after surgery. They stay behind the interior wall. "What about you?" "I'll make them think this room is still occupied." Reeve looked at the rifle in her hands. "You planned for this?" "No, you hid weapons in a medical cabinet." "I planned for something." A grenade rolled through the damaged doorway. It bounced once across the floor. Leah screamed. Mara moved before anyone else understood what they were seeing. She kicked a steel instrument cart onto its side, trapped the grenade beneath it, and shoved the cart toward the concrete entrance partition. Down! The blast lifted the cart from the floor. Metal twisted. The shock wave slammed Mara against a bed frame. For a moment, the ward vanished behind dust and ringing silence. Reeve crawled toward her. "Mara!" She pushed herself upright. A thin line of blood ran from her temple, but her eyes were clear. "I'm fine." "You were thrown across the room." I said I'm fine. The rear door crashed open. 2 insurgents entered near the supply station. Mara turned from one knee and fired twice. The first man fell behind the shelves. The second took cover and fired blindly through boxes of gauze and saline. Mara rolled behind a bed. Rounds tore through the mattress above her. She listened. 3 shots. Pause. 2 shots. The attacker was firing in short bursts and shifting to the left. Mara raised the steel bed rail just high enough to catch his reflection in the polished surface. 1 exposed shoulder. 1 breath. 1 shot. Silence returned. Briggs stood at the western junction, staring at her. The woman he had mocked for carrying a needle had just cleared 2 entrances while protecting patients who could not move. Mara rose and crossed to the eastern doorway. Outside, muzzle flashes flickered near the damaged vehicles. The main assault force had pinned down the guards at the northern wall. The hospital was being isolated, not simply attacked. They wanted something inside. Or someone. Mara examined the dead attacker's radio and removed the earpiece. A voice spoke through static in a language Reeve did not understand. Mara did. Her expression changed. "What are they saying?" he asked. She listened for another second. "They know the hospital layout." "How?" "Someone gave it to them." The voice returned. This time, it mentioned a room number. "Surgical room 2. Mara looked toward the sealed corridor where the most critical patients had been moved. One of those patients had arrived under armed escort that afternoon. His chart listed only a false name and a series of classified restrictions. Reeve followed her gaze. "They're not here for medicine." "No." Mara replaced the magazine and moved toward the corridor. "They're here for the man we were ordered to keep alive." Briggs stepped into her path. "You can't hold the whole hospital alone." Mara looked at the bandage around his arm, then at the fear he was trying to hide. "I don't need to hold the whole hospital." Outside, Boots moved through the courtyard. Mara raised the rifle. "I only need to hold this hallway." The hallway lights failed as Mara reached surgical room 2. Darkness swallowed the corridor. For half a second, only the emergency monitors remained visible, small green lines moving across black screens, each one marking a life that could not be moved quickly. Mara pressed her back against the wall and listened. Boots in the courtyard. 2 men near the eastern entrance. At least 3 moving behind the building. 1 more scraping metal against the rear service door. They were surrounding the surgical wing. Captain Reeve caught up with her, breathing hard. "Who is the patient?" Mara checked the corridor ahead. "You were told not to ask." "I'm asking now." He was an intelligence source. Reeve looked through the narrow window in the surgical door. Inside, a heavily bandaged man lay unconscious beneath a thermal blanket. 2 armed guards had delivered him that afternoon, then left before sunset without explanation. What kind of intelligence? The kind people cross borders to silence. A burst of gunfire sounded from the ward behind them. Lieutenant Cole answered with 3 uneven shots. Briggs shouted something Mara could not hear. She raised the rifle. They found the western junction. Reeve reached for the surgical door. "I need to stay with the patients." "You will." "And you?" Mara removed the sling from the rifle and wrapped it tightly around her forearm. "I'm changing the direction of the fight." Before Reeve could respond, she moved back down the corridor. At the western junction, Cole crouched behind an overturned medicine cart. His sidearm shook in his hands. Briggs was beside him, pale and sweating, holding a recovered rifle against his uninjured shoulder. Neither man had fired accurately. Rounds struck the walls above them, forcing both lower. Mara slid into cover. "How many?" she asked. Cole swallowed. 3. Maybe 4. 3. How can you know? 4 men would use 2 angles. Briggs looked toward the corner. "Can you see them?" "No." "Then what are you waiting for?" Mara listened. 1 attacker shifted his weight. Another changed magazines. The third whispered an order from farther back. She pointed to Briggs. "When I move, fire once into the ceiling." He stared at her. "The ceiling?" "1 shot. No more." "That won't hit anyone." "It isn't supposed to." Mara looked at Cole. When they turned toward him, cover the center of the hall. Cole nodded slowly. "And you?" "I'll take the side passage." Briggs tightened his grip. "Why should we trust this?" Mara met his eyes. "Because they're coming whether you do or not." That ended the argument. She moved first. Mara slipped through a narrow supply doorway and disappeared into a dark service corridor running parallel to the main hall. Briggs waited 3 seconds, then fired once into the ceiling. The shot exploded through the enclosed space. The attackers immediately shifted toward the sound. Cole rose and fired from behind the cart, forcing them back. At the same moment, Mara emerged through a maintenance door behind their position. "Drop your weapons." 1 man turned. Mara fired low, knocking his rifle aside before he could aim. The second tried to move behind a support beam, but Briggs stepped into view and covered him. For once, the corporal said nothing. The third attacker ran toward the courtyard. Mara let him go. Cole looked at her in disbelief. "Why didn't you stop him?" "Because frightened men lead you to the person giving orders." She moved to the broken window and watched the runner cross the open ground. He did not head toward the eastern breach. He went south, toward the abandoned motor pool. A figure stood there beneath a damaged awning, holding a radio and directing the assault from cover. Mara lifted her rifle. The distance was short by her old standards, but smoke drifted across the courtyard, and the target remained partly hidden behind a concrete pillar. Briggs watched her settle into position. Her breathing slowed. Her shoulders became still. The noise around her seemed to fade. "What unit were you with?" he whispered. Mara adjusted the optic. "That no longer matters." "It matters to me." She kept the crosshairs steady. "SEAL Team 7. Briggs stopped breathing for a moment. Cole looked at the faded trident on her case again. "You were a sniper." Mara's finger rested against the trigger guard. "I was the sniper they sent when missing wasn't allowed." The commander near the motor pool raised his radio. Mara fired. The radio shattered from his hand. The man stumbled backward and vanished behind the pillar as confusion spread through the attackers. Mara immediately shifted her aim toward the floodlight controls beside the courtyard. Her second shot struck the panel. Every exterior light blazed on at once. The insurgents who believed they were hidden suddenly stood exposed in white light. Cole stared through the window. "You planned that." Mara lowered the rifle. "No." She looked toward the surgical wing as new gunfire erupted outside. "I adapted." Then the hospital radio came alive. A strained voice broke through the static. "Field Hospital, this is Falcon Actual. Response team is 8 minutes out." Mara checked her remaining ammunition. The magazine was nearly empty. Beyond the courtyard, more figures were moving toward them. 8 minutes. In a firefight, it was an eternity. Mara looked at Briggs and Cole. "Now we find out whether you can follow orders." 8 minutes. Mara had survived missions decided in less. She checked the corridor, the courtyard, and the faces around her. Lieutenant Cole was trying to steady his breathing. Briggs held the recovered rifle against his shoulder, but the bandage on his arm was already darkening with blood. Neither man looked ready. That did not matter. "Cole," Mara said, "take the Western Junction. Fire only when you have a clear target." He nodded. "Briggs, stay behind the support column." Briggs frowned. "I can fight. You can barely stand." "I'm not hiding while everyone else." Mara stepped close enough that he could see the blood drying along her temple. "This is not about pride." Her voice remained low. "It is about keeping people alive." Briggs looked away first. Mara handed him 2 magazines. "You watch the surgical corridor. Nothing gets through that door." He accepted them. "What about you?" "I'm going outside." Cole stared at her. "That courtyard is exposed. That is why they will not expect it." Another burst of gunfire struck the front of the hospital. Mara moved through the maintenance passage and reached a narrow service exit on the southern wall. She opened it only far enough to study the ground. Smoke covered part of the courtyard. The damaged floodlights created long, broken shadows between vehicles and concrete barriers. The attackers were regrouping near the motor pool, using hand signals now that their commander's radio had been destroyed. Mara counted 7. 2 near the fuel truck. 3 behind a maintenance barrier. 2 moving toward the hospital's southern entrance. More than they could stop from inside. She slipped through the door. Her boots touched the ground without a sound. The nearest attacker was 20 meters away, facing the hospital. Mara moved behind an overturned equipment crate and rested the rifle along its edge. The first shot struck the ground beside the fuel truck. The men there dropped into cover. The second shattered a side mirror on a vehicle across the courtyard. The attackers turned toward the opposite direction. Mara was not trying to hit them. She was moving them. Inside the hospital, Cole heard the shots shift away from the Western Junction. "She's pulling them outside," he said. Briggs looked toward the surgical room. "She's pulling them toward herself." Mara crossed behind a line of damaged vehicles while the insurgents fired at the false position she had created. Rounds tore through metal several meters from her. She stayed low. One attacker broke from cover and moved toward the service exit. Mara intercepted him before he reached the wall. She struck his rifle aside, drove him into the ground, and pulled the radio from his vest. The exchange lasted only seconds. A voice came through the earpiece. "Move to the roof. Take the nurse alive." Mara froze. They knew who she was. Not simply that someone inside could fight. They knew they were looking for a nurse. She pressed the transmit button. "This is Mara Vance." Silence answered. Then a man spoke in careful English. "We wondered when you would reveal yourself." Mara scanned the rooftops. "Who is this?" "You took something from us 3 years ago." Her expression hardened. 3 years earlier, in a valley hundreds of miles away, Mara had led the extraction of an intelligence officer whose information exposed an insurgent supply network. The operation had cost her team 2 men and ended her field career. The patient in surgical room 2 was not a random source. He was the same officer. The voice continued. "Give us the witness, and the wounded live." Mara looked toward the hospital. Through a shattered window, she could see Briggs standing guard at the corridor. Leah was moving between patients. Reeve was working beneath emergency lights. The attacker believed those lives could be used against her. "You came into my hospital," Mara said. "You are in no position to threaten us." Mara found the speaker. A figure stood on the roof of the administration building, partly hidden behind a ventilation unit. He held binoculars in one hand and a detonator in the other. Wires ran from the device toward charges placed near the hospital's oxygen storage tanks. Mara lowered herself behind the vehicle. One shot would have to disable the detonator without triggering it. Wind moved smoke across the courtyard. The angle was narrow. The target's hand was almost completely concealed. Inside, Briggs heard her voice through the captured radio. "Mara." She did not answer him. Her breathing slowed. The years between the field hospital and her final SEAL mission disappeared. Her fingers settled against the trigger. The man on the roof raised the detonator. "Last chance," he said. Mara placed the crosshairs on the only exposed edge of the device. "No," she replied. "This is yours." She fired. The bullet struck the detonator at its exposed edge. Plastic shattered. The device spun from the commander's hand and disappeared behind the ventilation unit. For one terrifying second, nothing happened. Then the wires hanging from the rooftop went slack. The oxygen tanks remained intact. Mara shifted her aim. The commander dropped behind cover before she could fire again, shouting orders to the men below. The courtyard erupted as insurgents moved toward the hospital from 3 directions. Inside, Briggs heard the shot and saw the wires fall away from the tanks. "She stopped it," he said. Cole glanced through the broken window. She had 1 shot. Briggs tightened his grip on the rifle. She only needed 1. The southern doors shook under heavy fire. Mara ran from the overturned vehicle toward the nearest concrete barrier. Bullets struck the ground behind her, throwing sparks from the gravel. She slid into cover and checked the captured radio. The enemy commander was still transmitting. "Roof team, move. Southern team, breach now." Mara pressed the radio close to her mouth. "Briggs." "Static." Then his voice answered. "I'm here." 2 men approaching the southern entrance. "Wait." Until they crossed the ambulance. Briggs looked down the corridor. Through the damaged doorway, he could see the shadow of the parked ambulance outside. His wounded arm trembled. Mara heard his breathing through the radio. "Do not fire early," she said. "I know." "No, you don't." Briggs swallowed. "Then tell me." "Let them believe the doorway is unguarded." Outside, the 2 insurgents moved along the side of the ambulance. One carried a rifle. The other held a breaching charge. Briggs waited. Every instinct told him to fire. He remembered Mara's words. This was not about pride. The first man crossed the rear wheel. The second stepped into view. "Now," Mara said. Briggs fired. His first round struck the concrete beside them, but the attackers dropped into cover exactly where Mara expected. From the courtyard, Mara had a clear angle. 2 controlled shots ended the threat. Briggs stared through the doorway. She had used his fire to force them into her line of sight. "I missed," he whispered. "You did your job," Mara replied. The word stayed with him. On the rooftop, the enemy commander emerged again, no longer holding the detonator. He signaled 3 men toward the maintenance ladder. Mara saw them move. They were trying to reach the hospital roof, where the thin structure would give them direct access to surgical room 2. "Cole, roof access." Cole turned toward the stairwell. On it, he ran with 2 security guards who had finally broken away from the northern wall. Their uniforms were dusty, their faces strained, but they followed without hesitation. Mara changed magazines. 1 left. Across the courtyard, the commander realized what she was doing. He pointed toward her position. Every remaining rifle turned. Concrete exploded around Mara. She pressed lower behind the barrier as fragments cut through her sleeve. The captured radio crackled. "You cannot protect everyone," the commander said. Mara checked the blood running along her forearm. "I don't need to." A pause. "I only need to protect them until help arrives." In the distance, engines thundered. The response team. Armored vehicles appeared beyond the western gate, their headlights cutting through smoke and dust. The attackers began to break formation. Some fled toward the eastern wall. Others fired wildly at the arriving convoy. The commander stayed on the roof. His eyes remained fixed on the hospital. Mara saw him pull a pistol and turn toward a skylight above the surgical wing. He was going in alone. She left cover. Rounds followed her across the courtyard. but the enemy line was collapsing. She reached the administration building and entered through a shattered side door. The stairwell was dark. Footsteps echoed above. Mara climbed quickly, rifle held close, every breath measured. At the roof access door, she found Cole wounded beside the frame. "He got past us," he said. "Stay down." "Mara, he's heading for the skylight." She stepped onto the roof. The commander stood 10 meters away, aiming through the glass at Surgical Room 2. Inside, Reeve was shielding the unconscious witness with his own body. The commander heard Mara behind him. He turned. His pistol rose. Mara's rifle was already empty. The click echoed between them. He smiled. "You were too late." Mara let the rifle fall against its sling. Then she drew the suppressed sidearm from beneath her medical jacket. His smile disappeared. The shot was quiet. The commander fell before he could pull the trigger. Below, armored vehicles surrounded the hospital as the remaining insurgents surrendered or fled into the hills. Briggs reached the courtyard just as Mara came down from the roof. He looked at the blood on her sleeve and the dust across her face. "You saved all of us." Mara looked past him toward the surgical corridor. "No." She watched Leah and Reeve continue treating the wounded. "We saved each other." Dawn arrived slowly over forward operating base Calder. The first light touched the eastern ridge, revealing the damage the darkness had hidden. One section of the perimeter wall had collapsed. 2 guard towers were blackened by fire. The courtyard was covered with shattered glass, spent casings, torn medical supplies, and deep tracks left by the response vehicles. The field hospital was still standing. Barely. Inside, the wounded filled every reinforced room. Doctors moved from bed to bed under portable lights. Medics carried blood packs through narrow corridors. The sound of gunfire had been replaced by quieter noises, strained breathing, clipped instructions, the soft alarms of medical monitors. Mara Vance stood at a sink near the surgical ward. She washed the blood from her hands. Some of it belonged to the patients. Some belonged to her. A piece of shrapnel had cut through her sleeve, leaving a deep line along her forearm. Captain Reeve had ordered her to sit down twice. She had ignored him twice. "You're bleeding through the bandage," he said from behind her. Mara turned off the water. "So is half the hospital. That does not make yours less important. It can wait." Reeve looked at her for a long moment. Hours earlier, he had known her as the quiet nurse who remembered every patient's medication and never raised her voice. Now he knew she had once served as a SEAL sniper, led classified operations, and held a hospital against an organized assault. Yet the strangest thing was how little she had changed. She was still checking charts, still adjusting blankets, still asking frightened soldiers were they hurt. "You could have told me," Reeves said. Mara dried her hands with a clean cloth. "Would it have changed how you treated me?" He considered the question. "I don't know. That's why I didn't." Across the ward, Briggs sat upright in bed 5. His wounded arm had been stitched again, and a fresh bandage crossed his shoulder. The arrogance that had filled his voice the previous night was gone. He watched Mara approach without speaking. She placed a cup of water beside him and checked the circulation in his fingers. "Any numbness?" "No, dizziness." "A little. You lost more blood." "I remember." Mara adjusted the sling. Briggs looked toward the broken windows. "They said the response team found charges along the oxygen storage wall." "They did." "And the commander had the detonator." "Yes." "You made that shot from the courtyard." Mara secured the final strap. The device was exposed. Briggs almost laughed, but the sound never came. "You make everything sound simple." "It rarely is." He lowered his eyes. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Briggs said, "I was wrong about you." Mara continued checking the bandage. "You were wrong about several things. I treated you like you didn't belong here." "You did." "I thought because you were a nurse." His voice trailed off. Mara looked at him. "Because I was a woman," she said. Briggs did not defend himself. "Yes." The honesty seemed to cost him something. He stared at his hands. "Why didn't you put me in my place?" "I told you to stay in bed." "That's not what I mean." Mara understood. He was asking why she had not revealed the trident, the missions, the rifle, or the years of training. Why she had allowed him to laugh. Why she had said nothing when a single sentence could have silenced the room. "You had already decided who I was," she said. "Anything I told you would have sounded like pride." Briggs looked up. "So you waited for the attack?" "No," her voice hardened slightly. "I hoped I would never need those weapons again." The answer settled over him. For Mara, the The battle had not been an opportunity to prove herself. It had been a return to something she had tried to leave behind. Briggs glanced toward the surgical corridor, where the intelligence source remained alive under armed protection. You saved him. I protected a patient. You saved me too. Mara checked the water cup. You followed instructions. Eventually. Work on that. For the first time, a faint smile touched Briggs's face. Yes, ma'am. Mara stepped away. As she moved down the central aisle, conversations faded. Soldiers who could stand slowly rose beside their beds. Those who could not sit up lifted their heads. Lieutenant Cole stood near the admissions desk with his arm in a sling. When Mara passed, he straightened. Then he saluted. It was not a perfect salute. He was exhausted, injured, and covered in dust. But it was sincere. One by one, the others followed. Briggs, Foster, the security guards. Even Captain Reeves stood quietly beside the surgical doors. No officer had given an order. Mara stopped in the middle of the ward. The morning light entered through the shattered windows and stretched across the damaged floor. She looked at the men and women standing before her. You do not salute nurses, she said. Cole kept his hand raised. No, Chief. His voice was steady now. We salute the person who held the line. Mara's expression remained composed, but something moved behind her eyes. A memory, perhaps. A name. A team that had once stood beside her in another valley. Slowly, she returned the salute. Then she lowered her hand. Get back to work. The room came alive again. Beds rolled. Radios crackled. Medics moved through the aisles. Outside, engineers began repairing the wall while helicopters circled above the base. Mara returned to Private Ellis, the 19-year-old whose shoulder she had been stitching when the first bullet entered the hospital. He was awake. You finished it, he said, looking at the incomplete stitches. Mara pulled on a new pair of gloves. I finish what I start. Ellis watched her prepare the needle. Were you really a sniper? Mara leaned closer to his shoulder. I'm your nurse. That wasn't my question. No, she resumed the stitches. It was the answer you needed. Beyond the ward, sunlight reached the ridgeline. The night had revealed what Mara had never needed to announce. Strength did not always enter a room wearing medals. Sometimes it carried clean bandages. Sometimes it spoke softly. Sometimes it stood unnoticed beside a hospital bed until the moment everyone else needed it to become something more. Mara never asked the soldiers of Calder to respect her. By sunrise, she no longer had to.